Everybody in the world.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you guys yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to all involved at the network. Also leave any questions, comments, or concerns about the show, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into our next segment of today's show and talk about some of the fantasy football draft strategies that are defining this upcoming fantasy football draft. Now, in terms of draft strategies, and tomorrow I'll go over this a little bit more in depth, as for the second time ever, I'm going to be presenting you guys my own fantasy football mock draft that I did. I believe it's integral to really pick a lane to choose from in how you draft your fantasy football team, because there are going to be a lot of different people telling you a lot of different things about how and which routes to take. And so these ideas really are steeped in not just tradition, but how you view importance in position and how you take that with you into your draft. And so, looking at all the notes I took down, I think there are many interesting yet controversial options that are either warnings or things you can really carry over into how you view this. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, the first strategy involves, well, with the new heightened sense of the running back market, the heightened aura surrounding it all. How to define the first two picks. Because in terms of the running back market, you really have a lot of high-end talent that drops off immediately as you get into later rounds, even like round 3. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the mock round. When you really have that 1-2 pick at the beginning, you're really kind of lost in space after that, because you have a solid a solid running back. Either McCaffrey, Hall, whatever guy you want to pick at the top of your rankings. And then when you go down through later rounds, you're realizing that, oh no, I don't have a good secondary option. So there are two ways to think about this. One is a popular strategy of hero running back, where you go out swinging and try and get two guys at the top end of the draft, the first or second rounds, that really define the running back market. Or you take the zero running back strategy and wait a little bit so that your team doesn't necessarily have a high-end running back, but it has two quote-unquote solid, decent options. And the way I think about those two kind of drastic decisions is that either way, you are kind of getting balance. And you know that my personal value in a fantasy football team is balance. If it's hero running back, you get a Christian McCaffrey and a someone else. Christian McCaffrey, I don't believe, is always going to have as many good games as people think. I think that the 49ers are a team that distributes the wealth. So try and swing for a guy. Like I said, there are guys like Spears and White that you might want to take flyers on. And there are some other guys, such as Kenneth Walker, who's gone under the radar a lot, but still is performing like a top 10 running back in fantasy. So, with hero running back, you have more opportunities to diversify your running back room, and most importantly, still value someone like a McCaffrey or Hall. Whereas with the zero running back strategy, by waiting, it also allows you to have more balance, because there is still a second tier left in running backs. I still think that, say, Kenneth Walker to, Ramondre Stevenson or something like that, there's a second tier there to be had. And they're guys that aren't going to get you 20 to 25 points or anything ridiculous like that, like you expect out of the higher end of this class. But they are still, at the end of the day, very solid options. The bottom line with selecting running backs is that no matter what, the strategy you employ will not necessarily define your team. Because if you're the hero, you have one of the top 2 picks, top 3 picks, what have you, and you swing for the fences, you know you're going to have a guy who, like, you're not dropping and will start for many weeks. But you also have a guy who, let's say McCaffrey gets injured. He has a good injury history. He is going to immediately step in and just give you a solid balance of points. Remember, running backs don't necessarily win you leagues. They're solid pieces of the puzzle. So, defining the running back position is ultimately up to you. I'm just giving you 2 different routes that are very popular. But at the end of the day, you don't necessarily have to sweat the position as much as you think. Now let's go more position by position. We kind of looked a little bit at the running backs. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But let's switch to QBs. Because QBs seem to be more set in stone than people think. With the running back market, you're kind of taking flyers, and you might be more interested in streaming a running back than a QB. QBs are definitely tiered. There's levels to them. You have your elite guys who probably will get overdrafted at the end of the day. We'll talk about that a little bit in other shows later in this week and next. Like Mahomes, Allen, Hurts, guys of that nature. Then you have your mid-level guys like Tua, Trevor, those guys who are in prove-it years. And then you have your streaming options like your Goffs and Staffords, guys who aren't necessarily viewed as starters but could potentially break out for you. So, with QBs, it's very interesting because there are at least, say, 8 to 12 guys who I would say would be confident, a lot of people would be confident in taking in this kind of fantasy setting. I would say anyone from that elite to mid-level tier, and we cut it off at around, say, Trevor Lawrence, you would be comfortable with starting. Also, in terms of streaming a quarterback, it's not necessarily something that you should adhere to, but it's a nice little strategy. It was the reason last year that I really was desperate. To start off the year, I unfortunately had auto draft on, so Deshaun Watson of all people was my quarterback. So I found myself having to stream, and that's where I fell into guys like Jared Goff and CJ Stroud, who were more consistent at the QB position, was able to kind of keep me afloat in my fantasy football season. And so, the QB position, while set in stone, you can definitely play around with a lot. You don't have to be locked into a certain philosophy. You don't have to be locked into saying, oh, Chris said 8 to 12 guys I'm going to take. I'm going to key on one of those guys. I'm going to queue him up, and I'm going to draft him. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you can expand your horizons a little bit. There are definitely streaming options out there who I'm comfortable with saying they can start at least 5 to 10 games in your fantasy football season. I'm not saying that that's a given, considering that there are a ton of QBs to kind of sift through in terms of deciphering whether or not they really are going to perform for you in fantasy. But there's definitely a ton more opportunities for you at the QB position than, say, the running back. And then the wide receiver position. The wide receiver position is definitely topsy-turvy. It's definitely a lot of superstardom at the top. And then you're throwing darts to pick and choose at the end. Let's talk about the superstars. Because like I said when I talked about a guy like Randy Moss, these superstars aren't necessarily guys who in 25 to 50 years are going to be necessarily revolutionized and viewed as a figurehead of the movement as Randy Moss. Because I think what brings them down is the lower end guys. Guys who aren't necessarily people you would take right away in your fantasy teams. Then you have these kind of topsy-turvy choices as well in terms of new blood coming into the league. How do you weigh the options then? And I think that's a very curious choice to make, because when I look at guys like CeeDee Lamb and Justin Jefferson, they're in wide receiver rooms where they're viewed very highly. They're unlike any other wide receivers that I know. When you look at rookies, they're also going to be viewed very highly because they're on teams that desperately need production out of someone. So, you see what I'm saying in terms of how the wide receiver market has drastically transformed from a guy like Randy Moss, who always performed, to now rookies who have similar opportunities to stars who aren't necessarily in the best wide receiver room situations. Because Lamb and Jefferson are going to get a ton of targets because they know they're the wide receiver ones, and there's not many others behind him who can really take some of the load off their backs. Similar with Garrett Wilson. Maybe Mike Williams is going to be a stud. Similar with Devontae Adams. A lot of frustration and tension in that situation. Same with Chris Olave. There are a ton of names out there, and there are only a select few where you might not take them because of how deep their receiving room is. Take a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, for example. He's one of the best receivers in the league, but because of the fact that Sam Laporta is there as well, you might not take him because you're considering target share. The wide receiver position has changed so drastically from Randy Moss to now that I can't really define it. But ultimately, when I think about these draft strategies, just find a path that works for you and how you want to play the game. Because ultimately, there are just so many drastically different takes on how to define fantasy. But I'm just offering you mine. Coming next, we evaluate a very weird situation in terms of QB room in the league. Russell Wilson and Justin Fields in Pittsburgh. You definitely won't want to miss this segment coming up on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily